pleasant afternoon. We are to discuss the following topics falling under the comparative economic development. And as you can see, we are starting off by defining what is a developing world.
Good day everyone, I am Cheska May Acero and I will be discussing the definition of the developing world and the basic indicators of development, which are the real income, health, and education. So first and foremost, how do we define the developing world? Per capita income is the most common way to define the developing world. It is a measure of the amount of money earned per person in a nation, which is used to evaluate the standard of living and quality of life of the population. The World Bank, which is an international financial institution, is the best known system that offers classifications of countries by their economic status. In the World Bank's classification system, 213 economies with a population of at least 30,000 are ranked by their levels of gross national income per capita. These economies are then classified as low-income countries, low-middle-income countries, upper-middle-income countries, high-income OECD countries, and other high-income countries. Sometimes a special distinction is made among upper-middle-income or newly high-income economies, designating some as newly industrializing countries that have achieved relatively advanced manufacturing sectors. Yet another way to classify the nations of the developing world is through their degree of international indebtedness. The World Bank has classified countries as severely indebted, moderately indebted, and less indebted. As of 2023, these are the new thresholds for GNI per capita. The classifications are updated each year on July 1 and are based on the GNI per capita of the previous year. So here, low-income countries are defined as having a GNI per capita in 2022 of $1,085 or less. Now moving on to the next section, here are the basic indicators of the three facets of development. Real income per capita adjusted for purchasing power, health as measured by life expectancy, undernourishment, and child mortality, and educational attainment as measured by literacy and schooling. First, let me discuss you the difference between GDP and GNI. Gross domestic product measures the total value for final use of output produced by an economy, by both residents and non-residents, while GNI comprises GDP plus the difference between the income residents receive from abroad for factor services, less payments made to non-residents who contribute to the domestic economy. And in accordance with the World Bank's income-based country classification scheme, GNI per capita is often used as a summary index of the relative economic well-being of people in different nations. Purchasing power is the amount of goods you can get for 1 unit of currency. For example, in the US, the average price of a Big Mac across all markets is $4.79. In Sweden, the cost of a Big Mac is 44 krona. 44 krona is equivalent to $5.13. That means that in the US, you can get 20.8% of a Big Mac for $1, while in Sweden, you can only get 19.5% of that burger. Besides average incomes, it is necessary to evaluate a nation's average health and educational attainments, which reflect core capabilities. Table 2.3 shows some basic indicators of health and education. Life expectancy is the average number of years newborn children would live if subjected to the mortality risk prevailing for their cohort at the time of their birth. Undernourishment means consuming too little food to maintain normal levels of activity. And literacy is the fraction of adult males and females reported or estimated to have basic abilities to read and write.
A pleasant day to everyone. I am Abigail Destresa and I will be discussing the holistic measures of living levels and capabilities and the characteristics of the developing world diversion within commonality. Now, let me tackle the concept of New Human Development Index. The most widely used measure of the comparative status of socioeconomic development is presented by the United Nations Development Programme or UNDP in its annual series of Human Development Reports. The centerpiece of these reports, which were initiated in 1990, is the construction and refinement of its Informative Human Development Index or HDI. Human Development Index is an index measuring national socioeconomic development based on combining measures of education, health, and adjusted real income per capita. The new HDI, like its predecessor, ranks each country on a scale of 0, lowest human development index, to 1, highest human development, based on 3 goals or end products of development. First is a long and healthy life, which is life expectancy at birth. Second, knowledge, which is the combination of average schooling attained by adults and expected years of schooling for school-aged children. And lastly, decent standard of living, which is the real per capita gross domestic product adjusted for the differing purchasing power parity of each country's currency to reflect cost of living and for the assumption of diminishing marginal utility of income. The diminishing marginal utility is the concept that the subjective value of additional consumption lessens as total consumption becomes higher. There are two steps in calculating the new HDI. First, creating the three-dimension indices, which are health index, education index, and income index. Second, aggregating the resulting indices to produce the overall new human development index. The formula for computing the dimension index is actual value subtracted by the minimum value divided by the difference of maximum value and minimum value. For example, in life expectancy index, the actual value is 64.6 and the minimum value is 20, divided by the maximum value which is 83.6 and the minimum value then results to 0.701. The formula for computing the new Human Development Index is 1/3 of the Income Index plus 1/3 of Health Index plus 1/3 of Education Index. The use of geometric mean in computing the new HDI is very important. When using an arithmetic mean in the HDI, which is adding up the component indexes and dividing by 3, the effect is to assume perfect substitutability across income, health, and education. Thus, as UNDP notes, the new calculation captures how well-rounded a country's performance is across the three dimensions. Moreover, the UNDP argues that it is hard to compare these different dimensions of well-being and that we should not let changes in any of them go unnoticed. The chart depicts the Philippines HDI from 2014 to 2021. As you can see, our HDI dropped 0.01 point in 2021 due to the transition from pandemic. Now, let's move on to the next topic, which is the characteristics of the developing world. But first, let's identify what are the new things in the new Human Development Index. Number 1. The gross national income per capita replaces gross domestic product per capita. Number 2. The education index has been completely revamped. Two new components have been added: the average actual educational attainment of the whole population and the expected attainment of today's children. Number 3, there's an expected educational attainment. The other new component is somewhat more ambiguous. It is not an achievement but a UN forecast. Number 4, the two previous components of the education index, which are the literacy and enrollment, have been correspondingly dropped. Number 5, the upper goalpost in each dimension have been increased to the observed maximum rather than given a predefined cutoff. Number 6, the lower goalpost for income has been reduced. Number 7, another minor difference is that rather than using the common logarithm to reflect diminishing marginal benefit of income, the NHDI now uses the natural logarithm. Number 8, possibly the most consequential change is that the NHDI is computed with a geometric mean rather than a simple arithmetic mean. First characteristic, lower levels of living and productivity. In fact, at very low income levels, a vicious circle may form, in which low income leads to low investment in education and health, as well as plant and equipment and infrastructure, which leads to low productivity and economic stagnation. This is known as a poverty trap, or what Nobel laureate Gunnar Myrdal called circular and cumulative causation. The Philippines belongs to the top 15 most populous country. The Philippines has been classified as a lower middle income country ever since the World Bank came up with its classification scheme, whether internally in the early 1980s or as officially published since 1989. However, these are the 12 countries have highest GDP per capita as of 2023. Second characteristic is lower levels of human capital. Human capital, which includes health, education, and skills, is critical to economic growth and human development. In terms of health and education, high-performing developing countries are much closer to the developing world than low-income countries. Pupil-teacher ratio or student-faculty ratio is the number of students who attend a school or university divided by the number of teachers in the institution. It shows that the lower the pupil-teacher ratio shows greater achievement in grades kinder to grade 3. Students facing socioeconomic disadvantages showed greatest gains in smaller class sizes during primary grades. Students enjoy longer-term benefits the more year they spend with reduced class sizes and a lower ratio of students to teachers. The third characteristic is higher levels of inequality and absolute poverty. To understand the breadth and depth of deprivation in developing countries, it is also necessary to consider the rich-poor divide within individual developing countries. Many middle-income countries have very high levels of inequality, partly because Latin American countries have historically been both middle-income and highly unequal. A large majority of extreme poor live in low-income developing countries in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, which corresponds to their low average income levels. Extreme poverty is caused by a lack of human capital as well as social and political exclusion and other deprivations. Development economists use the concept of absolute poverty. It is the situation of being unable or barely able to meet the subsistence essentials of food, clothing, shelter, and basic healthcare. Extreme poverty causes great human suffering, so alleviating it is a top priority of international development. Development economies have also become more interested in how poverty and inequality can lead to slower growth. This chart shows the proportion of population covered by at least one cash benefit, vulnerable persons covered by social assistance, and unemployed persons receiving unemployment cash benefits by income level of country during 2020. Next characteristic is higher population growth rates. Europe and other now developed countries experience rapid population growth. However, in recent decades, the majority of population growth has been concentrated in the developing world. Middle-income developing countries exhibit greater variation, with some achieving lower birth rates comparable to those found in rich countries. The birth rate in low-income countries is roughly 3 times that of high-income countries. Crude birth rate is the number of children born alive each year per 1,000 population. Both older people and children are often referred to as economic dependency burden. Dependency burden is a proportion of the total population aged 0 to 15 and 65 above, which is considered economically unproductive and therefore not counted in the labor force. This chart shows the crude birth rates around the world on year 2020. The UN projected that the births per 1,000 people will decrease as of 2050 and 2100. While the annual percent of change will increase. The birth rate is one of the most important determinants of the country's population growth, potentially impacting policy decisions about the health system, education, and economy. Now, let's move to the next characteristic, which is greater social fractionalization. Low-income countries often have ethnic, linguistic, and other forms of social division, sometimes known as fractionalization. It is significant ethnic or linguistic and other social divisions within a country. The greater a country's ethnic, linguistic, and religious diversity, the more likely there will be internal strife and political instability. Ethnic and religious diversity do not have to result in inequality, turmoil, or instability, and unqualified statements about their impact are impossible to make. The broader point is that the ethnic and religious composition of a developing nation, as well as whether or not that diversity leads to conflict or cooperation, can be important determinants of the success or failure of development efforts. Now is the larger rural populations but rapid rural to urban migration. The shift from agriculture to manufacturing and services is one of the hallmarks of economic development. In developing countries, rural areas have a much higher proportion of the population and urban areas have a much lower proportion. Middle-income countries are rapidly catching up to the developed world in terms of proportion of manufactured goods in their exports, despite the fact that these goods are typically less advanced in terms of skill and technology content. As you can see, there are still more people living in the rural areas than in urban areas in the Philippines in 2022. This suggests that many are still sparsely populated, have low housing density, and are located far from urban centers. The chart shows that urbanization decreased from 46.99% in 1990 to 47.41% in 2020. Lower levels of industrialization and manufactured exports. The term industrial countries refers to the original Group of Seven or G7 countries, as well as other advanced economies such as smaller European countries and Australia. Industrialization is associated with high productivity and income and has been a hallmark of modernization and national economic power. Since we are known as an agricultural site, the Philippines has the highest share of the labor force employed in agriculture among the countries shown in this chart. This means that many people are employed and involved in activities that produce goods or services for pay or profit. However, many people consider work in this field to be a demeaning job. Next is adverse geography. Many analysts argue that geography must play some role in problems of agriculture, public health, and comparative development more generally. The extreme case of favorable physical resource endowment is the oil-rich Persian Gulf states. Resource endowment is nations' supply or usable factors of production, including mineral deposits, raw materials, and labor. Clearly, geography is not destiny. High-income Singapore is almost directly on the equator, and parts of southern India have recently experienced tremendous economic dynamism. Before colonization, some tropical and subtropical regions had higher per capita incomes than Europe. Lastly, lingering colonial impacts and unequal international relations. In Colonial Legacy, talks about most developing countries were once colonies of Europe or otherwise dominated by European or other foreign powers, and institutions created during the colonial period often had pernicious effects on development that in many cases have persisted to the present day. This is why, if you look at some of developing countries, you will notice that they have a history of being colonized by Europe. Both domestically and internationally, developing countries have more often lacked institutions and formal organizations of the type that have benefited the developed world. Domestically, on average, property rights have been less secure, constraints on elites have been weak, and a smaller segment of society has been able to gain access to and take advantage of economic opportunities. What is property rights? Property rights is the acknowledged right to use and benefit from a tangible or intangible entity that may include owning, using, deriving income from, selling, and disposing. In external dependence, developing countries have been less organized and influential in international relations, which can have a negative impact on development. Developing countries frequently express grave concern about various forms of cultural independence, ranging from news and entertainment to business practices, lifestyle, and social values.
Thank you, Mrs. Rosa. I hope you guys are still with us. This is like Mariel Dayaon, and I am about to discuss some distinctions between low-income countries and developed countries in their earlier stages, and to assess when to expect convergence among these two. So how does low-income countries today differ from developed countries in their earlier stages? The status of developing nations differ in many key aspects from that of the developed countries when they began their age of modern economic growth. 8 significant distinctions in the initial conditions were identified, each of which necessitates a unique examination of the prospects of growth and requirements for modern economic development. So the first significant distinction is the physical and human resource endowments. By endowments, we mean the quality or characteristics inherent to something. In this particular case, we refer to the physical and human resource endowments of developed countries in their earlier stage, so as compared to low-income countries today. The natural resources are frequently less abundant in developing countries today than they were when developed countries began their modern growth. Several developing nations were blessed with large supplies of petroleum, minerals, and raw commodities for which the global demand is rising. But on the other side, majority of less developed nations, particularly in Asia, where more than half of the world's population resides, lack sufficient natural resources. We may also notice the contrast in the endowment of skilled human resources. The inventiveness, managerial abilities, technical skills of a country's workforce, as well as its access to essential market and product information at a minimal cost, are among the factors that determine its capacity to exploit its natural resources, begin and sustain long-term economic growth. Another difference is the relative levels of per capita income and GDP. The real per capita income in low-income countries is on average lower than it was for people in developed countries in the 19th century. In fact, around 40% of people living in developing nations are striving to make ends meet. Today's developing nations started their growth process at the bottom of the international scale of per capita income. Next on the line is the climatic differences. The majority of developing countries can be found in tropical or subtropical climate zones, while it has been noted that the countries having the most economic success occupy a region of temperate zone. Say for example, extreme heat and humidity in most poor countries contribute to the deteriorating soil quality and the rapid depreciation of many natural goods. It affects the productivity level of certain crops, regenerative growth of forests, and poor health of animals. Not only that it causes discomfort to human workers, it can weaken their health, reduce their desire to engage in strenuous physical work, and lower their levels of productivity and efficiency. Now as to population size, distribution, and growth, the rapid population growth constitutes another important difference between less developed and developed nations. The latter experienced slow rise in the population growth, which grew as industrialization advanced. This is mostly a result of declining death rates and gradual increase in birth rates. Moreover, the developing nations has seen an annual population growth rates above 2.5% in recent years. Next is the historical role of international migration, wherein this long-standing channel for surplus labor has essentially been shut down, yet many of the migrants from developing to developed nations are precisely the highly educated and skilled individuals that these nations can least afford to lose. This particularly relates to the idea of brain drain, which represents a loss of valuable human resources but could also prove to be a serious constraint in the future economic progress of developing nations. The other distinctions between low-income countries today and developed countries in their earlier stages include international trade benefits, basic scientific and technological research and development capabilities, and the efficacy of domestic institutions. Now are the living standards of developing and developed nations converging? But what is convergence, by the way? It is a tendency for per capita income or output to grow faster in lower income countries than in higher income countries, so that lower income countries are catching up over time. The question is, are the living standards of developing and developed nations exhibiting convergence? If growth experience of developing and developed countries were similar, there are two important reasons to expect. First is the technology transfer. Developing countries need not to invent technology unlike those of developed ones. Hence, the former should be able to grow faster than those of developed countries. The second reason is the more rapid capital accumulation. As we expect higher investment rates in developing countries, may it be through domestic sources or through attracting foreign investments, capital would grow more quickly in developing countries until approximately equals of capital levels and output per worker were achieved. Provided with a huge difference in capital and technology across the average country incomes, if growth conditions were similar, we should see tendencies for convergence. So that includes this presentation for comparative economic development. I hope you guys have learned something from this video. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of the day.